Purdue Extension educator in Perry County, Indiana, and welcome to today's webinar. Today our topic is forages for sheep and goats, and we have a guest presenter this week. Our guest presenter is Alicia Rogers. She's the Ag and Natural Resources educator for Purdue Extension in DeKalb County, Indiana. She's been a part of Purdue Extension for over 10 years. She has a background in forages from Michigan State University. In her spare time, she and her husband have a small farm in very northeast Indiana where they raise dairy and meat goats, calves, pastured pork, and various poultry. And so I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Alicia. So everybody just tune in. We will be recording this session. And so if you need to come back, if you need to leave and come back later, you can. It will be posted to YouTube tomorrow.
All right. Thank you very much, Sarah, and welcome everybody to our noon Small Ruminants Lunch and Learn session here with the Purdue University Small Ruminants team. Like Sarah said, I'm Alicia Rogers, the Ag Educator up here in DeKalb County. And if you guys have any questions throughout, feel free to ask them in the chat box. I'll be taking a few breaks here and there between talking about the different forages and can answer your questions at that time. All right, so with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So like we said, the title of this presentation, we're talking about kind of the forages for sheep and goats. So try to choose those forages that are a little better adapted or suited to our small ruminants. This is going to be kind of focused here around the Indiana region. I know we have viewers from all over the U.S. and other countries as well. So obviously, if you have any questions at all about your specific region, contact your local extension office or grazing specialist, and they'd be able to help answer more specific questions. So I'd like to thank Dr. Keith Johnson, Purdue University's forage specialist, for just double checking a few of my facts on our presentation for this week, so that way I'm presenting the most accurate information for you all. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So, slideshow. All right. The first question we need to think about when we're looking at hay and pasture fields, things like that, is what exactly are you looking for in your hay and pasture fields? What do you want to get out of it? What do you want your animals to get out of it? How do you want them to perform? Do you want them to be just specifically grass-fed? If so, that may require a few different forages. I'm looking at those than maybe if you were going to supplement with hay and grain, things like that. So what is it you want to get out of your hay and pasture for your animals to be able to provide them with the best nutrients possible? So just basic broad overview, when you're looking at choosing your forages, obviously the first thing you want to do is to check your soil type. A lot of different forages do better on different drainage classes, especially than others. Some like somewhat poorly drained, some like poorly drained soils, some like just well-drained soils. So you need to know what type of soil you have before you actually even put that seed in the ground. And that's easy to do. You can talk to either your local Natural Resource Conservation Service office, your local Farm Service Agency, or you can actually look up a program through the Natural Resource Conservation Service called Web Soil Survey. And I'll include a link of that in the text box, or the name of it, later when we get done. But it's actually a really neat website to go on. You can put in your address or the location of your field. You can go in and search for it. And through the different tools that they have there, they can tell you what type of soil you have, what type of drainage, if it's going to work well for planting or things like that. So that's a really great website to check out if you want to see what your soil type is before you get planted or if you're planning on renovating as well. Second thing you want to do is make sure you take some soil samples to help determine your soil quality. So you may know what type of soil you have, but it's a little more difficult looking at your soil to be able to tell what nutrients are in your soil. So if you don't have correct balances of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, potentially some of our micronutrients, you could have issues getting those seeds growing and going or continuing on like you want them to. So you need to have a soil test done. Very easy to do. Just kind of go out and take some samples here and there in the field, mix them in a plastic bucket, take them to a local soil testing lab, and they should be able to send you back a result of your test. A little more in depth than that, but that's kind of the broad idea on doing soil samples. Third thing you want to look at is determine the specific need of your forage. So is the field you're planting in going to be hay cuttings, where you're going to be doing 4 or 5 cuts a year? Are you going to be doing specifically grazing? Are you going to be doing a mixture of the two on that field? That'll kind of help determine what your forages look like, kind of what you want to get out of them. Also, are you working on renovating that field? So do you just want to put an annual in there for the year, just so that way there's something green growing that your animals can still graze? Something that would be like a warm summer annual, so that way you can get something during the kind of the warm seasons of the year. Especially here in Indiana, you get kind of that slowdown of our cool season grasses and such. So those are things to consider. And then once you put all these 3 things together, basically you can find the forage that best meets your soil and your need. Now there's a wide variety of forages out there. There's a wide variety of different seed companies out there that always want to try to sell you your seed. So just talk to your neighbors, other sheep and goat growers in your area, see who they recommend, who they've worked with, see who's got the most positive results with their work, and kind of go from there. So, oh, sorry. All right. So, next thing we're going to look at is kind of looking at the difference between what you might call a pure stand and a mixed stand when we're looking at our fields. So a pure stand basically is going to be just one type of forage. There's no intermixing. It's just one type out there, so it's just alfalfa. It's just an endophyte-free tall fescue field. It's just that species growing out there. So basically what happens when you put in a pure stand is you're reducing the stand management difficulties because you're reducing the number of pesticides needing to be used. Because you have that one species out there and that's just what you want to grow, it makes it a lot easier when you're out there making herbicide, pesticide applications if you need to, instead of having to worry about applying something like Post when you're doing alfalfa so that way it kills out the grass, or something on your grass and not killing your legumes. Things to consider. The nice thing about pure sands is it does increase your forage quality just because you can cut at a specific time when that forage is at its most nutrient dense, especially when you're looking at pure legume stands. So things like our clovers, our alfalfa, our bird's foot trefoil, those can be all incredibly nutrient dense when they're harvested at the correct time. But when you're mixing in some grass and things like that, typically that will decrease our overall forage quality because usually our grass and our legumes aren't always growing at the same rate. So you may get one that's a little more mature than the other, and that can affect our forage quality versus just the pure stand. But we need to look at the other side of it too. We need to look at having a mixed stand or a polyculture in our fields. So basically having a mixed stand or a polyculture helps reduce our need for nitrogen fertilizer because typically you have a legume, so a nitrogen-fixing plant growing with our grasses, so that way they work concurrently together. The legume helps to kind of, or sometimes we'll have some heaving issues, so that means in the spring, or reduces the heaving issues because in the spring, legumes with the tap roots, so something like an alfalfa plant, can heave. So that means when the soil is going through freezing and thawing, it moves up and down and can move those tap roots out of the ground. But by having something like a sod-forming grass in there with the legume, it helps keep those tap roots under the ground. It helps reduce soil erosion because, again, you have a combination of something like a taproot, potentially a bunch-forming grass, so one that kind of forms bunches, along with sod-forming grasses that holds the grass or holds the soil in place. So that's another benefit of having a mixed stand. And it can also reduce our bloat concerns. So if you were to turn small ruminants out on just a fresh field of alfalfa, it's not as much of a concern of bloat as you'd have maybe with cattle, but there is still that bloat concern on some of our legumes. So by mixing the legumes with some of our grasses, it helps kind of reduce the amount of potential bloat plants that our animals are taking in each mouthful. So, however, with our mixed stand, we need to be cautious because other things that we consider with the mixed stand is it can increase our stand longevity. So instead of having something like potentially a bird's foot trefoil field, where if you can get it established, it may not have the longevity, something like our clovers, something like our alsike and red clovers don't have the best persistence. So by planting those clovers in with some grasses, you'll have a stand that will be there for longer. You may just have less clover here and there, but you can easily go in and broadcast feed those in. It also increases our forage quality when you add the legumes, because grass just doesn't have quite the same forage quality, again, that nutrient denseness, as legumes do. So when you're adding legumes to our grasses, you're increasing the grass overall forage quality by making it a mixed hay or a mixed pasture. You can also increase the productivity during the summer slump. So by having a warm season annual planted that can kind of come in when the heat of the summer comes in, it can still provide you with a great green overall pasture or hayfield during the slump of the summer versus having something like a cool season grass that'll kind of slowly decrease its productivity during the heat of those months. So just a few things to consider when you're looking at a pure or a monoculture stand versus a mixed stand or a polyculture stand. So this is kind of a chart showing what I'm talking about when I'm looking at cool season grasses versus warm season grasses. So you can see here the cool season grasses, they like growing in the cool seasons. So we have great shoot growth kind of in the spring. It's what we call the summer slump, so it kind of slows down in its productivity during the heat of the summer, and then comes back not quite as vigorously as it did in the spring, but it still comes back and grows fairly well in the fall. So those are our cool season grasses, and then our warm season grasses are obviously those that prefer the warmer temperatures. You can see spring, it starts to ramp up. The summer is when it's going to be most productive, as long as you have decent amount of moisture in the soil, and then the fall, again, it slumps off. And then typically, depending on where you live, but usually here in Indiana, something like a warm season grass usually is considered an annual, especially up here in my part of the state, just because if we have a normal winter, not that we've had normal here lately, but if we have a normal winter, there's usually too many colder days where that annual just does not persist. This is kind of looking at a few of our different forage species specifically and kind of how they interact with the cool and the warm season. So we can see our typical cool season grasses, things like Kentucky bluegrass, orchard grass, tall fescue. Then we get into our clovers, alfalfa, some of our small greens, ryegrass, and then into some of our summer annuals, so things like a Bermuda grass, switchgrass, pearl millet, things like that. All right, so when we're preparing a new seed bed, so you're starting basically from scratch. So you're starting the field at a complete blank. So not renovating, you basically, if it could have been an old cornfield or it's a prairie location, something like that, where you just want brand new field, starting from scratch. These are kind of the steps broadly that you would want to take to accomplish those tasks. So basically you want to start basically again by taking a soil test, seeing what that field has in it and what you need to add in order to grow the forage that you need. So you want to fertilize. Ideally, you want to apply lime or any of your other fertilizer about 6 months before planting. So if you don't plan on planting your seed until the spring, Getting out there in the fall, getting the soil test done, getting your fertilizer applied at that point in time. That way it has time to get into the soil, to kind of bind to that soil, and be ready for your forage when you plant in the spring. If you have to fertilize in the spring, you can just before you plant, but ideally you want that fertilizer in the ground kind of ready to go when you get ready to plant in the spring. You want to have a firm, well-prepared seed bed, so that means something that's rid of any extra grass clumps, large sections of sod, large clumps of soil, things like that. So basically when you walk out there, your foot should sink in just a little bit, but not to the point where you have something extra fluffy where you sink in a lot, or still firm where you're not sinking in at all. You also want to, if you're planting any legumes, so any clovers or alfalfa, birds foot trefoil, you want to make sure you get an inoculant for them. So the inoculant can be, typically it's rhizobia, which is basically little kind of microbia that help basically get those legumes to fix nitrogen. So that's what they kind of encourage legumes to do. So you have to have the correct rhizobia paired with that legume when it goes in the ground. So if you're planting alfalfa, you need an alfalfa rhizobia. If you're planting alsike clover, you need an alsike clover rhizobia, on and on. So you want to make sure that you seed at appropriate dates and depths. So for most of our perennial forages, you can plant at about a quarter of an inch is what you want to set your drill at, or your broadcast feeder. Your drill at when you're planting directly into the ground. So quarter inch for most perennial forages. For things like our sorghums, millets, small grains, if you're doing a forage soybean or forage cowpea, those go in at about an inch. Just because they're a much bigger seed, they need to go in at a little bit deeper depth. And then lastly, you want to provide adequate time for root establishment before grazing or harvesting. Just because you see your field starting to show green does not mean you need to automatically turn your animals out there or run the mower out there and start taking a cutting of hay. Most of our forages need at least 60 days to get established. Some of them need a little bit longer. There are a few out there that can get going a little bit earlier than that, but I like to wait at least 2 months because if you don't have that good root establishment, if you're going out there with a mower, cutting that off, it's going to take a lot longer for it to recover. Or if you're releasing your sheep or goats out there into the pasture and they're out there picking at the grass and the clovers, things like that, a lot of times they could be uprooting those plants or causing more root damage than may appear. So give it time, give those plants a chance to get established before you go out there. If you're going to be working seed into an old pasture or hayfield, there are a few other things you want to consider. So this would be basically renovating the field. So when renovating the field, you kind of want to follow some of the next steps. Obviously, first you want to control any of your broadleaf weeds. So depending on what you have out there will depend on the pesticide or the herbicide that you will use to control those weeds. So control your broadleaf weeds to start with. So have you tested your soil before for both your phosphorus and your nutrient content? Ideally, you want your phosphorus or your pH about 6.2 at your seeding time. That's where a lot of the seeds prefer it. So anywhere between about 6.2 and 7. And you want your phosphorus and your potassium at a little bit higher level because those provide they're kind of a good kickstart for your seeds to get going. You want to cut or graze your original stand basically to the point where you think most of your seed, especially if you're broadcast seeding, so out there with a big spreader, basically broadcasting the seed everywhere, where it will reach the soil surface. So that's where you're going to come in and graze maybe a little bit closer to the ground. Typically, if you're going to be doing any grazing, you want to leave at least 3 to 4 inches of grass or legumes, so it has a good grow back. If you're going to be renovating the field, then you want to probably nub it down to maybe 1.5 inches or so.
Mom, what's that?
Just so it has time to kind of takes a little longer to recover, so it gives those seeds that you're broadcasting a little bit better chance at getting established and growing as well. Obviously, you want to broadcast the seed before any green up occurs in the spring. So usually this would be late February, early March time frame. Getting to this point in the year, it's going to be getting a little bit late to try doing much broadcast seeding. I know even our pastures up here in Northeast Indiana, they're starting to get a pretty good cover on them. So it's going to be a little bit harder to do a good broadcast seeding at this point unless we go out and grub down those pastures and hayfields. But broadcast seeding, like I said, you can do, especially some of our clovers, you can do in February and March time frame. So that way, as that ground, again, is freezing and thawing, doing kind of the heaving, it can help work that seed into the soil as that ground is moving. You want to consider dragging the field with a harrow after or as the seed is being broadcast, just so that way you can ensure a little bit better seed-to-soil contact to get that germination going. And then lastly, we reduce competition to the young seedlings by grazing in the early spring or mechanically harvesting a portion of the pasture as hay in May. Again, this just kind of opens up that canopy so those newly germinated seeds can get good sunlight, can get a lot of the extra added benefits from that sunlight and not have as much competition, because those other plants are taking the time to recover and get going because they've been harvested or grazed. So those are just our very broad overviews of kind of putting seeds into the ground. The next thing we're going to kind of talk about is when you're looking at buying seed, what are some of those things you want to consider when you're looking at the label? So probably one of the biggest things is looking at the pure live seed. So pure live seed is basically all agriculture and turf seed must have what we call pure seed components. So what the pure seed or the bulk seed, so when they basically bag this up, what does that entire bin look like? So the bulk seed components are made up of the pure seed. So how much of that seed is basically any seed with at least half the embryo still intact, so that way it can grow. So how much of it is viable seed? How much of it is other crop seeds? So if you're out there and you're expecting getting a harvest of seeds off a tall fescue field, and you accidentally get a little bit of, let's say you have some volunteer wheat out there or some other forage crop, what are those seeds that are in there? How many weed seeds are we looking at in there? So was the field just completely one species, or were there some weeds that got in there and connected? And then how much of it is coating material? So is that seed bare, or has it been coated to help get through that planter easier? So basically all of these bulk seed components are equal to 100% when you add them up on the label.
I'm hungry. My hands are fine. What?
Yes. So, all right. So again, like we said, any pure seed or viable seed is any seed with at least half of the embryo still attached. So when you're looking at that label, obviously the higher the pure seed content is on there, the better you're going to have a field establishment, the better your species mix is going to get out there. There aren't going to be other surprises popping up that you didn't purposely plant. Some other things you want to look at is the germination rate. So all seed bags should have had or all bulk seeds should have had a germination test done on them when they were bagged. So that way you can see how well it should germinate. Obviously anything probably over an 80% on your seed bags is going to be pretty good germination rate. Any less than that, and it's going to be a little bit harder to get the bang for your buck. So if you're looking at a seed tag, like we'll look at here in a minute, and it says a 65% germination rate, That's not the best because you're only getting basically 65% to germinate of that seed that you're putting in the ground. So things to consider. So the seed tag also informs the consumer about what is in that lot of seed. So if you're getting a pasture mix put into that bag, what's the percentage of those seeds in that bag? And allows you to choose between different varieties and seed kinds by looking at those labels. So these are a couple of examples of what a seed tag would look like. So over here on the left is an organic pea. All right. So over here on the left is our organic pea, so like a cow pea going in the ground. So you can see here. Myself. Here, let me get my handy dandy little pen. So you can see here the pure seed that we're looking at, 99.22%. So pretty good pure seed going on there. There's a little inert matter, so it could be things like some soil or some other debris that got in there. But overall, you add those two numbers together and it equals 100%. Over here on the right-hand side, you get germination. So the germination here looks like it's about 89%. So that's a pretty good, pretty well germinating bag. Over here on the right side, we have what is called a pasture plus seed mixture. So you can see just the overall variety of seeds that you're getting in this mix. So a timothy, a red clover, a tall fescue, an Italian ryegrass, alfalfa, some orchard grass, and some white clover. So you can see there the purity, so basically what percentage you should get of each of those. The germination rates for all of these, so the only one that would be a little questionable would be this Ladino white clover here on the bottom. It's only at 60%, but everything else looks good. And then down here, we're looking at the coating material. So these seeds are coated. That makes up about 23% of our bag or our weight. And there's only about 0.06% weed seeds, 0.25% other crop seeds. So it could be a combination of some other grass or something like that. So overall, again, you add these purity numbers up, and it adds up to 100%. So that's kind of how when we're looking at a seed tag, that's what we're looking at. All right. So it's kind of looking at our seed, getting started, things like that. The next thing we want to consider is kind of what it is that we're raising our, especially when we're looking at pastures, what are we raising the pastures for? So this is a great resource from, I don't know where I got it from, but basically looking at the different dietary preferences of different livestock species. So we've got our cattle, which are typically grazed. We've got our goats, the horses, and the sheep. This is just a great diagram that shows kind of that percent of diet of what they prefer to eat if they were given the situation on what they want to eat. So we can see here the cattle, the horse, and the sheep primarily. They prefer to graze grass if they can. The sheep like some weeds in their diet as well. But when we're looking at something like the goats, they prefer what we would refer to as browse. So things like shrub, trees, basically kind of those woodier species that we might consider as weeds or kind of not the best thing to grow in the pasture. Goats actually prefer it if they had a choice. So just kind of some things to consider looking at their diets. Now, sheep and goats will both do well on grass and legume pastures, but again, if you want a little variety for your diet for your goats, they like some browse in there as well. So do we have any questions about getting started with our pastures or things like that before we head into our legumes? All right. Seeing none, we'll go ahead and get started with our legumes. So basically what a legume is it's a nitrogen-fixing plant. So its purpose is to go into the ground. It's part of the legume Leguminosae family that basically bears pods. So they contain one or many seeds. So you can think of them like snap peas. If you want to look at garden-wise, so snap peas, green beans. Looking at forage crops, you're looking at potentially forage soybeans, forage cowpeas, alfalfa, clovers, like we'll get into here in just a second. But the biggest thing about legumes to remember is they fix nitrogen in the soil. And that's why you need to inoculate them with those rhizobia particular to that legume. So, first one we're going to get started with is the queen of forages, the queen of legumes, and that's the alfalfa. It's called the queen just because it grows in so many different places. It has high forage quality. It's just kind of the status quo, I guess you could say, when you're looking at legumes. So alfalfa is a perennial. That means it comes back year after year. Now, it's not going to come back for 20 years straight. A lot of times if you're planting just a straight alfalfa field, it'll hit its peak between about year 3 and year 5. And after that, the overall density, the overall quality of your field will start to decrease. So usually if you're going to plant a straight alfalfa field, you're going to be doing good if you can get 7 good years off of that field before you have to completely renovate it. Alfalfa does kind of prefer well-drained soils, so that means there's not a lot of standing water. Has very high palatability just because of the leaf content, things like that, but it does have a pretty high chance of causing bloat. Like I said, because small ruminants are in the ruminant family, they carry the same digestive system like cattle do. They are ruminants as well. So if you get too much alfalfa or just the wrong combination of the alfalfa, you can cause bloat, especially if they eat too much of it. So just something to be considerate of. If you do have a pure alfalfa field or any alfalfa in your field, you do need to be cautious of what's called autotoxicity. So that basically means if you're going out into those fields to reseed them. So if your grass stand is good, but you want to kind of up your alfalfa content of the field, you're going to have to be cautious about that. So basically, if you can imagine putting a 55-gallon drum over that alfalfa plant, everywhere within that drum is where it's going to be toxic to new alfalfa plants growing, especially if it's been in the ground for more than about 6 to 8 months. So any longer than that, so if it's been out there for 7 years, it's got a pretty good autotoxicity ring going around it. So basically what's happened is that alfalfa plant has released basically this toxin in the soil that prevents other alfalfa plants from being seeded into or near it. So if you're going to reseed a pasture, especially a full alfalfa pasture, what I would recommend is, again, going out about 6 months, at least 6 months, before you plan on planting that alfalfa back in. Either putting a different green crop back in, so something like a summer annual, or overwintering it before you come back in the spring and plant alfalfa back in it. Alfalfa can be used for obviously hay, making silage or haylage, baleage, pastures, like we said, the green manure crop. All of those, alfalfa is pretty universal in how it can be used. So in this part of the country, when we're looking at seeding alfalfa, we're going to look at either between March 1st and May 1st, so right now in this time period, or between about August 1st and September 1st. So that basically gets us in the spring, so it has time to establish before it gets too warm, or it gets us in the fall, gives it time to establish before it gets too cold. So, and then the recommended seeding rates, we're going to look at about 12 to 15 pounds of that pure live seed per acre if you want a pure stand. Second legume we're going to look at is bird's foot trefoil. So this again is another perennial.
All it had was no cereal, but that's
It likes somewhat poorly drained soil. So if you have a little more wetness in the area, this might be a good one for you. Again, very high palatability because it has similar leaf content, things like that as alfalfa. But with this, there's low chance of bloating. Just the chemical compounds that are in bird's foot trefoil don't react the same as the alfalfa and some of the clovers do, so you don't get as high a chance of bloating, if any at all, with bird's foot trefoil. Nice thing about bird's foot trefoil is it does have a semi-branching root system. So instead of just having a single taproot holding that plant in, it does branch out a little bit, so it doesn't heave quite as big. Does incredibly well when mixed with Kentucky bluegrass. But two of the biggest things with bird's foot trefoil is it does not tolerate overgrazing well at all. So if you get it down below about that 3.5-inch mark, it will disappear. It does not handle overgrazing well at all. The other thing with bird's foot trefoil is it's very finicky on getting germinated and getting started. It's a difficult one to get germinated, so if you can get it in your fields, great. Manage it well so you can keep it in there, but don't be frustrated if it takes a lot or you just can't get it germinated. It's a special kind of plant when you're trying to get it germinated. So when you're looking at seeding this, again, similar to alfalfa, if you want to try to get it seeded, so you're looking at March 1st to May 1st or August 1st to September 1st. And this one is a little less. You're looking at just 4 to 6 pounds of pure live seed per acre. Again, for pure sand, the seed is a lot smaller than alfalfa. That's why you don't need quite as much. Looking at our next legume, we have alphyte clover. So this is what we would refer to as a wheat perennial. So it may come back year after year, it may not. It just depends on, there we go, what your winter's been like, how hard it's been grazed, how hard it's been harvested, things like that. It is well suited to poorly drained soil. So again, if you have a lot of moisture where you want to plant, this may be a good one. It does have high palatability. Again, the animals really like it, but it may cause some bloat, again, because it is a legume. And there may be some animals who are a little more sensitive to it that may cause photosensitivity. So basically, especially if it's a whiter animal, that white section of that animal may get sunburned more severely than another animal because of it. That photosensitivity can also lead to some liver issues. So things to consider. It's good to be used for pasture and hay. And the seeding dates for our alphyte clover, we're looking at January 1st to May 1st, or August 1st to September 1st. And then our seeding rate on alphyte clover, again, if you're looking at just a pure stand of clover, is going to be looking at about 6 to 10 pounds of that pure live seed per acre. We'll look at here in just a little bit some different mixes you could do, and we'll see when we mix it, obviously you want to decrease your seeding rates. Our next clover is going to be our crimson or our red clover, no, our crimson clover. This is a winter annual, so that means it likes the cooler temperatures. It's just there once. Can stand somewhat poorly drained soils, so it doesn't like real wet, doesn't like real dry, like somewhere in between. Again, some high palatability because it is that legume. It is the good leaves on it, but again, may cause some bloat. Can be used in pasture and hay, especially in kind of our southern states, so very southern Indiana and lower. Otherwise, it's a really high risk of winter kill. So just some other things to consider. And then our seeding dates for crimson clover, usually you're looking at mid to late July is your time period for these. And then our seeding rate, we're looking at about 20 to 30 pounds of pure live seed per acre. Next up, our white clover. So this again is a perennial. It likes poorly drained soil, very high palatability, but again may cause bloat, and good for pasture use only because it is a little bit lower growing clover, lower growing legume, and it does yield pretty low when you try to make hay with it just because of its growing nature. Our seeding dates for our white clover is usually January 1st to May 1st. So this is a great one if you can get out and frost seed it. So doing the broadcasting during the winter, kind of late winter months. or getting it in kind of August 1st to September 1st. And pretty low rate on our seeding rate. You're looking at about 2 to 4 pounds of pure live seed per acre with white clover. And then our last clover we'll look at is red clover. This again is a weak perennial. Does pretty well on all soil types though, so it's pretty adaptable to a lot of different regions. Again, high palatability because it is a clover, but it may cause some bloat. And it's an excellent pasture renovation crop. So if you want to switch over from, if you had the field in a cornfield before and you want to switch it to pasture, this would be a good clover to put in there to kind of get that kind of renovation started and going with maybe some grasses. And it's good for a short-term hay crop. Again, just does not persist well under most of our cutting systems when we're looking at 4 or 5 hay harvests a year. And then again, our seeding dates, another great one that you can do some frost broadcast seeding on. We've got January 1st to May 1st, or again, that August to September time frame. And this one, we're looking at about 8 to 10 pounds of pure live seed per acre. One more legume to talk about are cowpeas. It's not one that's talked about a lot, but it does have some great value to it. Cowpeas are annuals. Typically, they're grown for harvesting the legume, harvesting the cowpeas, eating those like that. But they do have forage varieties out there that have great leaves on them. They're well suited to somewhat poorly drained soils. Again, high palatability. You can manage these a lot like you could soybeans. So basically drilling them the same as you would a bean, things like that. So they do, it grows really well. It's an interesting crop. I haven't had a lot of experience with it, but there is some potential there, especially for our small ruminants. Seeding dates, we're looking at May 1st to July 1st, and our seeding rate is about 30 to 60 pounds of pure live seed per acre for this one. Then our last legume we'll talk about, we'll kind of cautiously talk about it because it is considered an invasive in many states, but it does have a lot of great benefits for small ruminants. So you need to check with your state before you look at this species because it could be considered invasive. So we're talking about Forages lespedeza. It is a perennial. It is well suited to somewhat poorly drained soil. It does have kind of some low to medium palatability just because it has kind of an off taste to it. But the benefit of this Forages lespedeza is research has shown it's been helped to prevent parasites. So it's a natural dewormer almost. Even the eggs and things like that on the ground don't survive well where this is planted. But unfortunately, like I said, many states consider it an invasive species. And actually in Indiana, it's illegal to plant this or even buy it as of April 18th. So just this past week. So things to consider with this species. If your state is lucky enough to have you be able to buy it, good seeding dates for this are kind of March 1st to June 1st time frame. And then our seeding rates are looking at about 20 to 30 pounds of pure live seed per acre. So that's kind of the information we have on our legumes. So does anybody have questions on the legumes? So I got a couple of questions here in the chat box. So how deep do you suggest tilling? So if you're working the ground, if you're starting with just a fresh field, I'd probably do a deep tillage. So probably at least 8 inches if you can, just because that gives you a good seed bed to start with, paves a good way for your seeds to get started and those roots to get established. If you're doing something like renovating a field, so you don't obviously want to till the whole field up, doing a no-till drill or just doing some strip tilling here and there in the field is just fine. So, best method to plant Sudan grass in a field that's sandy. So I'm not going to talk a whole lot about Sudan grass. I'll mention it here in just a little bit, just because with Sudan grass and small ruminants, From what I have found is it's a little more difficult to manage when you're working with small ruminants and Sudan or Sudan crosses, just because it can grow so quickly. So I'll talk about that here again. And again, the Sudan grass, you can plant that at about an inch deep. More questions here. Sandalwood. I didn't mention sandalwood just because, again, I was looking at forages here in Indiana. It's not a species that's grown a lot in this area, so that's why I didn't mention it. But there's a lot of great resources out there about it that you can look at. So what do I use in our own pastures? It's kind of one of those monkey see, monkey don't do. So for us, it's a combination of what we have on our pastures. Right now we have about 4 acres in pasture for our homestead. So out there, it's honestly a whole complete mix. I couldn't even tell you. So I do know there's some different grasses. So we do have some, I think there's some Timothy out there, some endophyte-free fescue. We've got some really good stand of clovers out there. I think my husband had a little bit of leftover alfalfa seed from planting a field one year. So he just went out there and ran it around until the planter ran out. Honestly, even though I have kind of the background in it, my husband doesn't always listen to what the forage specialist says. So it's kind of one of those wait and see what comes up, and I can either say I told you so or he did well. So so we had just kind of definitely a polyculture growing in our pastures. So all right. That we'll go ahead and get started kind of with our cool season grasses section. Be kind of conscious of all your time. So, cool season grasses, we are going to start off with orchard grass. It is pretty common, grown pretty much across the U.S. It is a perennial. It's what we call a bunch-forming grass. So, if you're out there chasing your sheep or your goats through the pasture and you keep tripping over these clumps in the ground, most likely it's going to be something like an orchard grass. They grow in bunches. They don't spread out nicely. But they like somewhat poorly drained soil, but it does have some nice medium to high palatability for a grass. Now, like I said before, grasses are not going to have the same full nutrient content that our legumes do, just because their leaves are typically thinner. They don't have as much nutrients in those leaves as our clovers and other legumes do. So, but for orchard grass, animals do like to eat it. It does have good palatability. It feels nice in their mouth. It's used for pastures, especially when you include it with a legume of some sort. It's great for hay because it does withstand at least a 4-cut system like alfalfa. So it does hold up well to grazing and doing several harvests of hay. If you're going to plant orchard grass, you want to look at about the March 1st to May 1st time frame. Again, we're getting close to that outside window for the spring planting. But you can come back in again that August, September time frame and plant it again. And you're going to look at about 10 pounds of pure live seed per acre when you're planting orchard grass, again, as a pure stand. Our next is Kentucky bluegrass. Again, another perennial, but this one is one that we call a sod-forming grass. So instead of growing in those bunches like an orchard grass will do, this one tends to spread out and likes to hold that sod, hold that soil in place a lot better. They like somewhat poorly drained soils. It's a very high palatability, so that's why you see it a lot. That's why Kentucky is known as the bluegrass state, because of the horse diets and things like that. Really, really palatable, really enjoyed by our animal species. The biggest thing about Kentucky bluegrass is it doesn't really do well under drought conditions. It doesn't persist well. It just gets, with it being a little bit smaller species, it doesn't grow quite as tall as some of our other grasses, and it tends to shrivel a lot more and not bounce back as easily if there is drought. Uses, again, pasture, excellent quality, but again, low yields, just because these leaves are small even for grass. and it just doesn't get that height that some of our other species does. Again, seeding dates for Kentucky bluegrass, we're looking at early February to early May, or August to early September, and about 5 to 10 pounds of pure live seed per acre. So, next up is going to be our ryegrass, and this is going to be our perennial ryegrass that we're going to talk about. There is an annual ryegrass that I'll mention in a little bit, but we're going to focus this slide on the perennial, so it just keeps coming back. Again, ryegrass tends to be a bunch-forming grass, again, growing in those bunches in your pastures and hayfields. Likes that somewhat poorly drained soil, very high palatability. Again, another species that's not all that drought tolerant, doesn't take the heat very well, doesn't bounce back as easily. Great thing about perennial ryegrass is there is quick establishment with this. So if you want to get out there and get a couple of hay cuttings off a year, this is one that you can plant early in the spring. Oh, sorry, scratch that. So planting for this is going to be mid-September to late October, about 15 to 20 pounds of pure live seed per acre. This is one that you could plant in the fall and then get out there in the spring and get a good first cutting off earlier in the year than maybe with our orchard grass or tall fescues. So, next up, we're going to look at improved tall fescues. So I say improved tall fescues because tall fescue is a grass species that's been around for millennia. It's been around for a long time. But what they were finding with the original tall fescue species is under certain conditions, it can develop endophytes in it that can produce toxins that then affect our livestock. So when you're looking at purchasing a tall fescue seed, you want to make sure that it either says improved tall fescues or endophyte-free tall fescues. So tall fescue is a perennial, again, comes back year after year. It's a good sod-forming grass, again, spreads out so it doesn't create those clumps. Likes the somewhat poorly drained soils, medium palatability. It's one that's not as preferred as some of our other species like orchard grass or timothy, like we'll get to next, or the Kentucky bluegrass. So if your animals had a choice, they'll eat it, but it's not going to be, they aren't going to enjoy it as much as they may some others. So it'd be kind of like us choosing between a filet mignon and a T-bone, I guess you could say. Used well for pastures, especially with a legume mixture. Does well with hay, and really great for soil conservation. And it is an excellent choice if you want to stockpile for winter grazing. So if you want to extend your grazing system, especially if you're doing grazing sheep and things like that, like my parents do, this is a great one that stands and holds on to some of its nutrients a little bit longer into the winter than maybe some of our other species. So in order to stockpile, what you would do is basically stop grazing that area. I would probably say early to mid-August, so that way you get time to get those plants to grow. And basically what happens is it becomes standing hay almost. So giving that plant a chance to kind of dry down and basically be out there as an available resource for those animals throughout the winter. So seeding dates for our tall fescue, you're looking at about March 1st to May 1st, and again, August 1st to September 1st. That's why it grows well with the legumes. You can get them planted in there at about the same time. And for a pure stand of our improved tall fescues, you're going to look at about 15 pounds of pure live seed per acre. And then the last grass, or cool season grass we'll look at, it's going to be timothy. So timothy, again, is another perennial, comes back year after year. It is another bunch-forming grass. So it forms the bunches out there in the pastures. Likes the somewhat poorly drained soils. Again, has a medium palatability. Our goats actually like it pretty well. but compared to something like the orchard grass or the Kentucky bluegrass, a little bit lower palatability than those. Again, great use in the pasture, for especially when mixed with a legume. Again, another good hay crop, especially if you want to get into a little bit of a niche market, kind of on the side, selling this to rabbit breeders. Rabbits absolutely love Timothy, so it would be a good little niche market if you wanted to sell a few bales here and there. And another good one for our soil conservation. So if you have a little bit steeper hills, things like that, this would be another great one. And our planting dates for Timothy, again, kind of February 1st to May 1st, so a good time frame with our clover. And then August 1st to November 1st. So it doesn't need quite as long to get established, so you can plant it a little bit later in the year if you need to. And so then this grass, we're going to be looking at about 3 to 6 pounds of pure live seed per acre. So, and that's a lot of information being thrown at you. Sarah posted the Google Drive doc where this will be posted afterwards, along with, she'll have the YouTube information as well, so we can go back. I'll also create a document that I'll put on that Google Drive that'll kind of summarize all this information for you as well. So that's kind of our cool season grasses. Again, there are several different species out there beyond what I listed. These are just the main ones that are commonly found here across Indiana. So with that, I've got a couple of questions here again. So what types of grass or legumes do you recommend for milk production? We'll get into some of those here in a little bit, but if you're looking at milk production, and especially for our sheep and our goats, obviously those that are going to have a little bit higher palatability. If they enjoy eating it, they're going to obviously intake more, or have a higher chance of intaking that, which will basically increase your milk production. So you want to look at those that have a little bit higher palatability, so something like our orchard grass, our Kentucky bluegrass, some of those species will help a lot. Looking at the legumes, looking at your clovers, alfalfa, any combination of a clover and alfalfa will be good out there, just to provide that good nutrient denseness for good milk production. So, have a hay field is 50% red clover, 50% Timothy orchard grass. Can I feed my sheep harvested bales from the field immediately, or do I need to wait until it goes through fermentation? So, obviously when you're making a dry hay, you want to make sure that it gets put up well, so it gets put up dry. Otherwise, if it gets put up too wet, there can be some molding issues and things like that going on. If it's being put up as baleage, if it's, again, the moisture is off on that, you can actually, like Connor talked about last week, you can actually increase mold issues and things. The biggest thing when you're putting up hay is you want to make sure it's just put up at the correct moisture, correct temperature, things like that. We'll occasionally feed a bale fresh out of the field, but personally what we like to do is go ahead and let it go through kind of that little bit of a sweat process, because all hay, once goes into storage, will kind of go through a little bit of a heating process before it's fully cured, I guess you could say, fully ready to feed. But usually that's done within about 2 weeks. So if you have to feed it right out of the field, you could, but it'd be preferred if you could wait just a little bit before those animals are fed that hay. So, all right. That will get to going with our annual grasses. So annual grasses are basically those that, for the most part, especially up here in this region, are only around for one growing season, so one growing year. First one I'm going to talk about is pearl millet. This again is a warm season annual. It's a bunch forming grass, so it kind of grows in those clumps, likes moderately well-drained soils, medium palatability. Really, there aren't a lot of prussic acid concerns with pearl millet as there may be with some of the Sudan or Sudan crosses. And pearl millet is a great one to use for supplemental pasture. So if you're working on renovating a field and you don't want to plant until fall, but you get it worked up in the spring, this is a great option to go out there and still have green growing throughout the year. So regrowth is typically a little bit slower than a Sudan grass, but it does come back. There are some brown midrib varieties out there. So basically that means they don't, they're like the brown midrib Sudan grass. So it's a little more palatable, a little more forage quality for our animals than maybe some of just the straight pearl millet. You can see here, kind of looks like a short corn, quite a nice size on the leaves, things like that for us to grow with for our animals. Planting dates for the pearl millet, we're looking at about May 1st to June 1st. So again, something that you'll seed in the mid to late spring, and you're looking about 15 to 20 pounds of pure live seed per acre. So that's an option there. So our next annual is going to be small grains. So things like our wheat, oats, barley, and rye. Just kind of lump these together because they're all cool season annuals. Medium to high palatability for these species. And it's great to be stockpiled or used in early season grazing. The nice thing about this is it can go from August 1st to September 1st. You can plant these. They'll come up in the spring, or kind of plant them in February 1st to March 1st to kind of have some of that kind of early to late spring options. So when we're looking at seeding these, our seeding rates are a little bit different for a few of the species, depending on what you want to go with. Again, because they're small grains, so kind of like an agronomic crop. When we're looking at oats, we're going to look at about 3 bushels to the acre. So we're not looking at pounds, but we're looking at bushels for most of these. So oats, 3 bushels to the acre. Wheat, we're going to look at about 1.5 to 2 bushels to the acre. Barley is going to be looking at about 50 to 75 pounds per acre. And then rye is going to be about 30 to 40 pounds per acre. So a little bit heavier planting than maybe some of our other species, just because they are annuals, so they're only around for 1 year, but it does provide a nice, dense, lush pasture, or even a hay crop if you want to do that. For us this year, we're actually going to go ahead and plant some oats and actually do some oatlage on part of what we're planting, so harvesting it and then basically making it into an oatlage bale, so it'll be kind of fermented down for our animals for later in the winter. So next warm season annual is going to be teff. This is one when I was in grad school at Michigan State that I actually got to do a little bit of research on, just because it wasn't quite as well known a decade ago as it might be now. Again, another warm season grass, another great sod forming grass. Nice thing about teff is it has very high palatability, especially if you have horses as well. Equine will sometimes turn their hay up or their nose up at their grain and choose the hay bale of this teff than their grain. So teff is also incredibly quick at regrowing and at its initial growth. So basically from the time that it's planted to the time that you could take a first cutting or a first grazing off of can be anywhere from 45 to 60 days. So very quick growth. And then the regrowth on it, we had harvested some plots up in kind of north central northwest Michigan, where one of our ag centers were up there on a Wednesday for a field day that was going to be on a Saturday. By the time we went back up there, we had just the right amount of moisture and temperatures. It was already up 3 inches from when we had mowed it on Wednesday. So very quick regrowth if it gets done at the right time. Great for emergency forages, hay and grazing. Again, because of that quick growth, you get quick green up. And basically your seeding dates, you want to seed it once those temperatures are greater than 65 degrees, the soil temperatures that is. So it does like the warmer temperatures a lot more. So you want to make sure that the soil is warm before you're planting the seed. So in this area, about early June would be about the earliest you would want to plant it. so about mid-July, in order to get at least one cutting off of it if you do the late July. Once you get later than that, basically the first light frost hits and this stuff's done. So if you're going to seed it, if you're looking at raw seed, so seed that is not coated, you're looking at about 5 to 7 pounds per acre. If you're looking at coated seed, you're looking at about 8 to 10 pounds per acre, which is kind of what I would recommend. Test seed is incredibly small, so if you can get the coated seed, it goes through a planter plate a lot easier than the raw seed. A lot of times it's difficult to get that plate turned down small enough so the seed isn't running out of the drill. So those are just kind of our warm season grasses. Again, I didn't really mention Sudan or Sudan crosses, just because what I have found with small ruminants is it's a lot more difficult to manage and stay ahead of, stay within a good growth range than maybe with some cattle. My parents, like I said, they raise both cattle and pastured sheep as well. They've tried doing the Sudan grass with their sheep for several years, and they've just found, even in very southern Michigan, that once it gets that warm temperature and it starts growing, it gets incredibly difficult for those sheep to stay on top of it fast enough for it not to basically dwarf them out and make it more difficult for them to grow. So that's why I didn't include Sudan in here. It is a viable option if you grow it on a smaller acreage or you have a large number of small ruminants you're trying to feed. It is an option, but like I said, it's a lot more management to it. I was just trying to provide some of those warm annuals that will be a little bit easier to understand or easier to grow. So, all right. With the fast-growing foliage, can baking soda be used to decrease the chance of bloat? Yeah. So you could certainly provide some baking soda, or sodium bicarb is another name for it, to kind of help reduce that bloat, reduce any diarrhea, things like that. So offering that if you're going to be having a lot of legumes is definitely a good option. Yep, good point. All right. So next up, we're going to talk about what we are going to call brassicas. So brassicas are basically plants that are used kind of as a miscellaneous forage here in the U.S. They could also be referred to as crucifers. So they're from the genus Cruciferae, and basically have originated in the area of the Mediterranean and utilized across Asia and Europe. So there's some that are becoming popular here in the U.S. Usually they're ready to graze in about 60 to 80 days after planting, so pretty quick green up with these guys. Mostly they're seen as kind of an emergency forage in drought years, but can be used to provide forage anytime from the spring through the winter. So those are kind of our overview of brassicas. So a couple of them that are most common, especially when we're looking at small ruminants, are things like chicory. So chicory, sometimes you may think of this as kind of the blue growing flowers across the side of the road during the middle of the year, especially if there are ditch daylilies coming up. You'll see the blue growing with the orange. I love that color combination. Just makes me think that, okay, we're here in the summer. It's a beautiful color combination. But there are forage varieties of chicory out there.
How do you like them to sound?
It is a biennial. Good. So that means basically it puts vegetation on 1 year, and then the next year it puts on its floral growth and sets seeds and then die. So it would be a biennial, but it can be a short-lived perennial. So if you have a little bit milder weather, so kind of down south, it could be where it comes back as a vegetative stage for 2 or 3 years before it dies off. So it likes well to moderately well-drained soil. So this is one that likes sand and things like that a little bit better. It produces a very high nutritive quality vegetation. Put those down. So it provides spring and summer forage with great growth rate. You can get about 50 pounds per acre per day on average of growth. of forage growth, not animal growth, but forage growth with planting chicory. So a lot of good growth with chicory during the spring and the summer. The issues that we see with chicory, though, is once that heat turns on, is it tends to have the issue of bolting. So basically, once that heat comes on, it's sending up its seed head, it's sending up its flower, and it's done producing vegetation. So that's kind of one of the issues. The other one is chicory can have a nitrate toxicity issue with it. So if we get under drought conditions, if we get frost, things like that, when we're looking at other species with nitrate toxicity, that's kind of what we're looking at. So those drought conditions especially can cause that nitrate to just concentrate in there. So it takes several days, if not closer to a week, for it to leach back out of that plant to make it safe for the animals to eat again. But if we are looking at seeding chicory, we're going to look at about April 15th to June 1st with a pure live seed seeding rate of about 3 to 4 pounds per acre. The next brassica we're going to look at is rape. So this is another cool season annual. There's kind of the regular rape, and then there's a winter adapted variety, so a winter rape. So very winter hardy if it is a winter rape. So that means you can plant it in the fall, and it can grow through the winter until it gets obviously too cold, but it still provides good vegetation throughout the colder months. Likes well to moderately well-drained soil. Again, some that don't like their feet wet as much. Produces high nutritive quality vegetation. So just like for us, if we're going to eat a salad, something like a spinach, a kale, something like that that has a lot more nutrient denseness to the leaves, to the vegetation that we're eating in our salad, it's the same thing here with our brassicas, especially with our rape and things like that. There's just a lot of nutrients condensed into those leaves. Has good regrowth when it's managed properly. Again, there can be some issues with bolting and some nitrate toxicity at times. And seeding rates, we're going to look at either kind of late April or late spring, so April 15th to June 1st for kind of that summer growth or late spring growth, or we're looking at about August 1st to August 30th if you want this to persist into the late growing season, kind of that November, December, maybe January time frame, but that could be pushing it a little bit. And our seeding rates, we're going to look at about 3 to 4 pounds of pure live seed per acre. And then our last brassica we're going to mention here are going to be the turnips. So these are going to be a cool season annual. So again, just around for a year. They prefer moderately to well-drained soil, so do pretty well in quite a few places. Again, very high palatability. So the nice thing about turnips is if you do have a pasture that you're working on renovating, if it's been something that's been into row crop production for several years, there could be like a hard pan under the soil where that disc line is, things like that, or tillage line. The nice thing about turnips is that with the bulb underneath, it can produce the roots that get down and kind of break up those hard pans, break up just that concentrated soil, things like that. Compacted, there we go, the compacted soil. So planting these turnips, especially with a warm season annual, can grow really well for getting a pasture if you're renovating it or completely starting new. Again, great late season grazing with stockpiled fescue or early grazing with some spring oats. So our planting for this date is going to be May 1st to August 1st. So it can be planted pretty well throughout the year. So you get either that good spring grazing or that late fall, early winter grazing with this. For the turnips, we're looking at about 1.5 to 2.5 pounds of pure live seed per acre with the turnips. Sorry about that. So the brassicas, that's kind of just the brief overview of a few of the ones I wanted to mention for us here today. So I've got a couple of other questions that came in doing that. So how do we know if a native fescue growing on your property is safe? I believe there are some tests that you can have run out there. So if you've harvested it for hay or as a fresh grass, you could send it off to one of your local forage testing labs. And I believe they've got some tests that they can run where they can test for that endophyte bacteria in there. So, and then what's canary grass considered, and can goats eat it? The canary grass, or reed canary grass, is a cool season grass. It really likes damp soil, kind of wetter soil, things like that. So it would be a cool season grass as well. Goats can eat it, but again, it's one that probably isn't quite as palatable as some of the others that we've listed. And like I said, most of the ones I listed are those that are commonly grown here in Indiana. Reed canary grass isn't quite as common here in Indiana. So. All right. So with that, we'll get started with kind of our last little section here, and these are the forbs. So basically, forbs are a high-value crop that has valuable advantages for our livestock. Really high energy levels in them, high protein levels, getting up to 20 to 23% in the vegetation. And basically what it is a mineral-rich herb is what you can look at it as. So that's our forbs. And the one I'm going to mention here is going to be plantain. So plantain is like the stuff that you'll see in your yard. It'll get kind of the spike on it. It can get stuck in your toes if you're walking barefoot out there, along with buckhorn. So plantain is a perennial. It adapts well to drier regions, less fertile soils, areas with lower pH or heavy clay soils. This is one you could put out there if your soil just is not doing well at all. If it's really poor, this will grow pretty well out there. It's got really high palatability. So like I said, it's a really nutrient-dense herb, basically, for our animals. Not really recommended as a monoculture just because there's such a high protein percentage in these leaves that it can cause some digestive issues, things like that. But usually they would be planted with a brassica, so something like a turnip or a rape or a chicory. So a combination of a brassica with this forb is a great combination, especially for some summer grazing. Seeding date on this is about May 1st to August 1st. And you're going to look at about 5 to 8 pounds of pure live seed for a pure planting. But like we said, we don't really want a monoculture of this, usually a polyculture. So you're going to look at about 1 to 2 pounds when you're mixing it with another brassica. So that's kind of the forb that I wanted to mention real quick. So I had a question here, is endophyte only a problem if fescue is dried for hay or if it's grazed fresh too? So endophyte can be an issue with the grazing as well. So it's basically when it goes under stress conditions, so things like drought, extreme drought, I should say, or if it's a heavy frost. So those are both times that you want to watch out for when you're grazing them, that if you've had a really heavy drought and then you get an onflush of rain, so you think everything greens up, you may still want to wait a few days to get that out of there. Same again with a heavy frost, so again, probably at 28 degrees and below, wait to put them out for a few days once you've gotten past that point. So again, just kind of a summary of we're looking at our perennials versus our annuals. So our perennials in our grasses are going to be our Kentucky bluegrass, our perennial ryegrass, our orchard grass, tall fescue, and timothy. Our legumes are alfalfa, birdsfoot trefoil, the ladino, alsike, and red clover. Again, the alsike and red are weak perennials. And then the Cercia lespedeza, again, considered an invasive in some of our states. And then our chicory as well, and plantain. So I've mixed that up on these two slides. So our annuals, when we're looking at grasses, we're looking at our barley, our rye, spring oats, our teff, our pearl millet, and ryegrass. And then legumes, we're looking at the crimson clover and the turnips. And then our others, so our brassicas and forbs, our brassicas will be our rape and our turnip. So again, the plantain is a perennial, not an annual. So these are examples of some seeding rates you could look at when you're looking at planting a mixed stand. This is just looking at a few legumes and a few grasses. If obviously there are some on here that, or some that I mentioned that are not on this list, but this is kind of a common mixture variety that you'll see here listed. So for example, if we want to do a primary legume of alfalfa, secondary legume of, let's say, our red clover, we're going to look at alfalfa planting about 6 to 8 pounds of pure live seed per acre, mixed with about 2 to 4 pounds of pure live seed of red clover. And then let's say I'm going to put an orchard grass in with it. So you're going to look at about 4 to 6 pounds of pure live seed for our orchard grass. So that would just be an example. Like we saw on the seed tags earlier as the examples, there are so many different pasture variety mixes out there available. Talk to your local seed dealers, find somebody that you recommend. A lot of times there may be an opportunity for you to mix your own blend. So if there are specific traits you want from different grasses or different legumes, if you want to add in some brassicas or forb, there are options out there where you don't just have to stick to what's on the bag. You can get mixtures and even make your own. So like I said, this is just an example just to show you what those seeding rates would look like if you were to make a mixed stand instead of a monoculture. And then lastly, the thing I want to mention real quick, especially when we're looking at our goat species, is like I previously stated, goats are considered mostly browsers, like we saw in that chart. They prefer to eat things like brush and shrubs. So basically, goats are selective grazers, selective browsers. So they'll basically eat the thing that tastes best to them at that time of the year. I can always count on it. If I get goats that get out, they have like a honing mechanism on them, and they run straight to my rose bushes every single time. Not that they get out that often, but if they get out, that's where they're going for some reason. The roses taste great to them because it's kind of a shrub. But so basically, the shrubs and brush and things like that are what they love. Goats will also eat the new leaves on trees. So if you have low-growing trees in your pastures, you'll notice they'll be out there on their hind legs trying to get to those leaves and stripping the tree of those leaves. So that's something to consider if you have goats, is that they do love those young, tender leaves. So they can cause some pretty good damage to trees. They can also kind of graze or peel away the bark on the tree and strip the tree of the bark, basically girdling the tree and killing the tree if you're not careful. So if you want trees in your pasture with your goats, you may need to fence around it. So just a couple more words on browse, some of those things that they prefer to browse when we're looking at things like perennials. So browse would be a warm season, things like cedar trees, elm greenbriers, maples, oaks, wild plums, multiflora rose. So if you have pastures that are overwhelmed with multiflora rose, goats love it. Other things would be like a honeysuckle vine. They love to browse on those. And then again, some more forbs, so those nutrient-dense herbs, or I guess you could say weeds if you wanted to. Things like burdock when they're just starting to leaf out, goldenrod, ironweed, dandelion, love dandelion. Some of our annual forbs would be lamb's quarters, pigweed, ragweed. Again, some other cool season ones that you could plant would be kale, or what they call swedes. So these are just kind of looking at some of those things that we browse or forbs that you wouldn't always consider being beneficial to our small ruminants, especially goats, but to kind of look at. So when we're talking about the forbs or herbs or what you might call weeds, weeds can actually have a whole lot of nutrients and be incredibly nutrient dense. So if you have a few things like common lamb's quarter or shepherd's purse or some pigweed growing out there. It's definitely beneficial to them. There's a lot of good crude protein. So that's kind of what we're looking at here on this chart. We're looking at crude protein, so how much protein percentage that plant has. So anywhere from like common lamb's quarter before it goes to seed, we're looking at 22% protein in that leaf. Alfalfa at its very best is going to be about 20 to 22% as well. So we're looking at something comparative to alfalfa. Common ragweed, early vegetative stage, 26% protein, so very high. And then our neutral detergent and acid detergent fiber, those are basically kind of the cellulose components in that cell wall or the breakdown of it, so how well it breaks down. So the higher this number, the harder it is for those animals to eat, so lower is better. So we can see here, regular alfalfa, our neutral detergent is about 28%, acid is about 23%, so lower numbers than that. Things, again, like the lamb's quarter, early season lamb's quarter, pigweed, again, our common ragweed when it's early. You can see that weeds do have some good nutrients to them to consider. So if you have a few here and there out there, it's not a big emergency. You can survive. The animals will enjoy it and get good nutrients from it. So just as an overall summary, I know we talked about a lot today. There's a lot to consider when you're looking at forages for our small ruminants. But basically, you want to start by having a good base for your seeds to grow in. So whether you're renovating the pasture, so doing no-till drilling or broadcast seeding, things like that, again, clipping it down short, having good soil quality to it, having the right nutrients in the soil for those seeds, or if you're starting from fresh, so having a good, clean seed bed. Either way, you want to have a good start for your seeds. Try to include some forages that will grow in different seasons. So if you routinely have pastures or hay fields and just have that summer slump going on and you're finding yourself having to feed hay in the middle of the summer, try to incorporate a warm season grass or a warm season like brassica, things like that, that can help get you some fresh, basically fresh produce, fresh forage for our animals through that midsummer stage. Again, remembering that goats and sheep do have very different diet preferences. So again, our goats prefer to browse if they can on our shrubs, brush, things like that. The sheep prefer to have grass if they can. And then choose, basically weeds, again, can be forages too. So weeds have great nutrient quality, nutrient value to them. So again, if you have a few weeds here and there, making sure that you still keep them managed, but remembering that the leaves can be great for forage for your animals too. And then lastly, just choose what works best for you and your operation. Like I said, we've talked about a lot today. There's a lot of information out there, especially from different seed dealers, things like that. But just find what works for you. It may take some trial and error. It may take a little bit of money here and there, but once you find kind of what works for you, use it. Use it to the best of your ability. Grow those animals like you want to. So these are a few different other resources you can look at. So obviously the Purdue Forage Field Guide is a great handy-dandy guide to have. This is where you can go to order it at the Media Distribution Center or the Education Store through Purdue. It's a great pocket guide. You can carry it with you out into the field. It contains all the information that I had here in this presentation, along with a bunch of other species. It includes planting dates, rates, how to renovate fields. It includes some potential weed issues or growth issues. It can include pest issues. So it's got a whole wealth of information just in this little pocket guide. So I'd highly recommend it. The What's in a Bag of Seed, that just goes into more detail of what that seed label looks like and what it says. And then the last two websites here, the E-Extension website, they have both a site dedicated to just goat information and then just sheep information. So the E extension is basically a collective of all the extension systems across the U.S. So it's a lot of good information and a lot of good resources. So with that, thank you, and I'd be happy to answer any last questions that you may have.
Two. German Shepherd. Put down. That's
All right, I don't see many questions coming in, so thank you all. Again, just want to remind you of next week's session. It's the sheep and goat nutrition. You can see the information here. And so if you want more about it, we have it posted in several places or here. And then this is just a rundown of the last several sessions we'll have. We don't quite have the links to the May sessions yet, but we will shortly, and we will get those published on the different pages and things like that.
Thank you all for attending today. I have put the links to the evaluation for today's program and to the Google Drive where you can get the materials from today's program. So we hope you will join us next week for Small Ruminant Nutrition. And so have a wonderful week. Thanks again for joining us.